Welcome to this week's edition of Mount Rushmore, where me, Trackside Larry, goes through my personal Mount Rushmore of each and every track on the Cup schedule. And this week, it's Echo Park Speedway, aka Atlanta Motor Speedway. I'd say this one was a little bit tougher to do than the Daytona 500. Could potentially be controversial depending on how you look at it. I had a certain view of it, and this is my Mount Rushmore for Atlanta Motor Speedway, starting with Cale Yarborough. I feel like two of the drivers on this list were pretty easy to come up with, and Cale is one of those drivers. Has 7 victories at Atlanta, 23 top fives, 29 top tens, 3,283 laps led. That is an insane number. It's a little bit over 600 more laps than second place in laps led. So Cale Yarborough, I thought was pretty easy to put into the Mount Rushmore. I think a lot of people would consider him a Mount Rushmore driver. All time wise for NASCAR, I probably wouldn't. I'd probably put him in the top. I would definitely put him in the top 10. I think there's a debate definitely for the top 5, but I probably wouldn't put him on my Mount Rushmore of NASCAR drivers. But I think there is an argument there. So for a lot of these races, we're gonna see a couple of the same drivers pretty often. Like we're gonna see a lot of Cale Yarboroughs. We're gonna see a lot of Richard Petty's. We're gonna see a lot of Dale Earnhardt, Jeff Gordon, Darrell Waltrip, Kyle Busch. There's a lot of Jimmy Johnson. There's a lot of drivers we're going to see quite often on these Mount Rushmore lists. And Cale Yarborough is one of those drivers that we're going to see pretty often. I was kind of debating Yarborough versus Petty as my first guy to put on this Rushmore because of the time that they were in. I felt like there was only so many competitive guys in different eras. There was way more competitive guys. So I did judge a little bit differently on those drivers, just to be honest. Yarborough versus Petty. I took Yarborough. I think Yarborough is probably the second best driver to ever race at Atlanta Motor Speedway. And I'll get to the best driver here in a moment. But before that, we got our second driver on the Mount Rushmore, and that is Jeff Gordon. Jeff Gordon has 5 victories at Atlanta Motor Speedway, 16 top 5s, 26 top 10s, and he's led over 1,000 laps, 1,297 laps led at Atlanta Motor Speedway. He had a lot of success at this racetrack, had his first career Cup Series start at this racetrack as well, in probably the greatest, one of the most iconic races in Cup Series history, one of the greatest races in Cup Series history. And Jeff Gordon, he has a great history at this track. I think he could have potentially had more wins if there wasn't a driver like Dale Earnhardt to compete with at Atlanta Motor Speedway. But Jeff Gordon did great at this track for many years, whether it was in the 90s, the early 2000s, in the 2010s. He just always seemed to perform very well at this track, even different iterations of the track. We had different layouts of the racetrack. We had different surfaces of the racetrack. He never got to experience this new one that we're on right now, which is kind of almost like a super speedway version of the track. They call it a drafting track. He never got to experience that version of the track. But Gordon, like I said, he's going to be on a lot of these Mount Rushmore lists. I would consider him a Mount Rushmore driver. I think he's on the Mount Rushmore of NASCAR Cup Series drivers, and not a big surprise to see him on this list. And the third driver on this Mount Rushmore, I think a lot of you already know who I'm going to say. Kind of already left little breadcrumbs that this driver is going to be on there. I consider him the best driver at Echo Park Speedway, and I consider him probably the best driver in NASCAR history, and that is Dale Earnhardt. Dale Earnhardt Sr. has 9 wins at Atlanta Motor Speedway, 26 top 5s, 30 top 10s, and over 2,000 laps led with 2,655. He's first in both wins and in top 5s, and he's second in top 10s and laps led. I thought it was pretty easy to put him on this list. He's one of the greatest of all time. I would say he is the greatest of all time, but I think there is debates on who is the greatest NASCAR driver of all time, but I think he's probably on everybody's Mount Rushmore. And he was just so phenomenal at this racetrack during that era of Atlanta Motor Speedway, like in the 90s especially, early 2000s, the late 80s. It was all Dale Earnhardt, Jeff Gordon, amongst a couple of other guys, and one other guy in particular that I'll get into in a second that was competing with these two drivers for many years at Atlanta Motor Speedway. Dale Earnhardt was just the best. He was the cream of the crop. He is the GOAT of Atlanta Motor Speedway. And that's one thing I should probably start adding on to all these too, is out of the four, name who I think the greatest of all time at that track is. And the greatest of all time at Atlanta Motor Speedway is Dale Earnhardt. No ifs, ands, or buts. I don't think that's a debate. The era he raced in, plus the stats that he has. Like, you look at someone like Richard Petty, who has amazing stats, but then you also have to take into account the era that he was in. It was not quite as competitive as Dale Earnhardt's era, or Jeff Gordon's era, or even the current era that we're in right now. Not quite as competitive. But nonetheless, Richard Petty has phenomenal stats at the racetrack, but so does Dale Earnhardt. So Dale Earnhardt, in my opinion, is the greatest of all time at Echo Park Speedway. And then the fourth driver on this Mount Rushmore. This is probably the controversial part because I didn't put Richard Petty on here. I think a lot of people are going to want Richard Petty on here. But like I was saying earlier, that's why I gave my slight explanation earlier on Cale versus Richard Petty, because of the era they were in. And neither of them were necessarily dominant at the racetrack. They both had a bunch of wins at the racetrack. Cale had 7. Richard Petty had 6. But the era that they raced in, Richard Petty raced, I think, over 60 races at the racetrack. Cale Yarborough raced over 40 races at the racetrack. With the era they're in, I honestly don't find those stats as impressive as these other drivers' stats. And I will include this driver in this because I feel like they would have so many more wins, so many more top 5s, top 10s, if he didn't have to compete with drivers like Jeff Gordon and Dale Earnhardt at this racetrack. And also the fact that he joined an up-and-coming race team at the time, and that would be Bobby Labonte. I have Bobby Labonte being my fourth driver on the Mount Rushmore. I personally think so. This might be the only track that we will see Bobby Labonte on a Mount Rushmore. He was so phenomenal at Atlanta Motor Speedway in the early 2000s, in the late 90s when he joined Joe Gibbs Racing. He was really great at this racetrack. 6 wins, 12 top 5s, 13 top 10s, and 959 laps led. If you look at it from a stat versus stat basis, Bobby Labonte versus Richard Petty, I would say if you purely look at the stats, Richard Petty has slightly better stats. But you have to keep in mind how many more races he raced, plus the competition that he had to face. Bobby Labonte, when he was winning these 6 races at Atlanta, had to beat Jeff Gordon and Dale Earnhardt, who were both phenomenal at this racetrack in a more competitive era. So I have Bobby Labonte on my Mount Rushmore for Atlanta Motor Speedway. And like I said, I think that might be the only Mount Rushmore we see him on. I think there is a chance he could end up on the Charlotte Motor Speedway one. Other than that, I don't know if we'll see Bobby Labonte again on these Mount Rushmore lists. So Bobby Labonte is on the Mount Rushmore for Atlanta Motor Speedway. But let me know your thoughts in the comments. What do you think about my Mount Rushmore? How would you do it differently? I think a lot of you probably would put Richard Petty on your Mount Rushmore, which is understandable. I definitely would understand that take. I think there's a couple other drivers that have had a really strong success at Atlanta, like a Jimmy Johnson. Jimmy Johnson was barely left off of my Mount Rushmore, so I could see you putting Jimmy Johnson above a Bobby Labonte or maybe even a Jeff Gordon at Atlanta Motor Speedway. But let me know your thoughts in the comments. What do you think about my Mount Rushmore, and who would you personally put on your Mount Rushmore for Atlanta Motor Speedway? All right, that'll do it for this week's edition of Mount Rushmore. Next week, we will be doing a Mount Rushmore for COTA. I don't know how we're going to do that. We only have so many races at Circuit of the Americas, but we'll do a Mount Rushmore for Coda. Maybe we'll include some Xfinity stats in there or something to kind of make it better. I don't know how we're going to do that, but I'm going to throw one together for Coda next week, and tune in for that and enjoy Echo Park Speedway this weekend. It is on Fox at 3 p.m. I am Trackside Larry saying peace.